Okay, thank you all for joining us. My name is Rebecca Oling from SUNY Purchase. Here today moderating the flowers of tomorrow are in the seeds of today. And joining us are Lisa Czirr, who's an associate librarian at SUNY Cortland's Memorial Library. She's the education liaison and manages the curriculum collection and the teaching materials center. Lisa received her MLS from the University of Buffalo. Her research interests include creative pedagogies and topics combining information literacy with teacher education or literacy. We also have joining her Jenifer Phelan, who has an MLS from the University of Albany and an MED in curriculum and instruction with a specialization in teaching and learning from Seattle Pacific University. She's an assistant librarian at SUNY Cortland's Memorial Library. Her research interests include information literacy instruction and student engagement. And their co-worker, Maria McLane, was supposed to be here today, but unfortunately could not join us and sends her regrets, but knows that we're in capable hands. So I will let you take it away. I'll go ahead and monitor the chat as best I can throughout. This session is being recorded, so please note that. We ask participants to stay muted and use the chat for questions, and then I'll ask you to go ahead and unmute to speak your own question when that time comes if you're comfortable.
Yes, thank you very much for that introduction. So I'm very happy to be here today and excited to present to you all. As we mentioned, we do have Maria. We wanted to just put her name on here, just give her the deserved credit she deserves because she did participate quite a bit in the actual project and then a little bit toward contribution toward the actual presentation as well. So I'm going to move us into a poll. So Jenifer is going to be putting the link into the chat as well. But if you can go to pollev.com/LCZIRR, that will get you to the poll. And I just want to know, we're curious about who is here today, right? Who do we have with us? I am an education librarian. The particular guide that we're going to be talking about is dealing with our teaching materials collection, which is really, pre-K, really through 12 resources. So resources for children, right, for our pre-service teachers to use in their classrooms. But I think that the concepts we're going to talk about are definitely going to be applicable across all disciplines, right? So there's going to be something, a little takeaway for everyone. But I'm always curious. So we've got people in the sciences. I see social, so maybe social, yep. So social sciences just blossomed up there, bloomed up there, right? I do see even public, hey, so some interesting things coming on. Preservation, streaming, great. I see something about justice. I see elementary, so psychology, health. Okay, yeah, pretty good range, pretty good range. So what I'm gonna ask everyone to do, if you can keep that poll link open, that'd be great because we will ask a few more questions throughout the session. It should automatically update when the next question pops up. So leaving it open is probably the best way to do that. But the link will come back and we can reshare it as needed. Okay, so let's see here. Make this click through. This one always takes, it's always a little delayed for some reason. There we go. So I'm going to talk about the background first. So why we got into this project, where it's coming from. So I'll give you a little overview of that. So how this all started, this was really something where a need definitely existed. So there were a couple of things going on here, but it was something that we needed not just a course guide for. As you all know, librarians who are familiar with creating course guides, those can be very specific, very much branded to the class and the assignment. And I really saw a need for something that would be useful beyond that as a general resource. It did start out with instruction. So it did start out in a very particular class. It was our EDU 340 class. So that class is dealing with culturally and linguistically responsive learners. That's the title of the actual course. And when they come to me, they're doing an assignment where they're looking for picture books that are culturally and linguistically responsive. So they need to know how to, the students need to know how to identify and search for these books. And so when this class started out, I was giving them some handouts and other class materials. And I said, oh, that guide, after doing it a little bit, we definitely need a course guide. And I thought, no, you know what, this would be really helpful if we branched out and made it a more general resource, because also questions from not just this class, but other questions would be coming to the reference desk, right? So we'd be getting other questions, other librarians would be getting questions from other classes and assignments that are also incorporating kind of other diverse themes, right? So I wanted this to also be something that could be a resource for the librarians in addition, right, who are answering these questions, because they might not be the subject expert, right, in this particular area or dealing with looking for children's literature. So I wanted to have ideas to help generate ideas for them, help generate ideas for any students who are using the guide. And of course, when we're talking about reference and we're talking about students visiting our desk, the big question I know that we always ask ourselves, right? What are they really looking for when they're coming in, right? And I think an even better way to put that is a little, maybe a kind of a subtle rephrase, not rephrasing, but just kind of, re-emphasizing, right? What are they really looking for when they come to the desk? I think that's always a big question in general. So something to think about is absolutely, are they looking for something that is looking for example, many identities within one book? That is something that sometimes they actually are looking for. So when students say multicultural, what do they mean, right? Sometimes they're looking for that kind of book where it's kind of a, a surface level, shallow comparison, right? A whole bunch of, it might be something like, food around the world, right? And it might be showcasing different cultures, right? All within one book, packed in one book. So is that what they're looking for? Or when they say multicultural, do they really mean, I just need something that's actually just cultural, which is sometimes and more often the case. They're looking for a book that maybe does more of a deep dive into a specific identity or culture, right? So that's something to think about. It's the difference between essentially a book that's on diversity and showing, and different diverse cultures, and a book that is showcasing one diverse topic or person, right? So that's something to think about. I know in 340, we talk about different levels of cultural responsiveness. So it goes on a range from culturally neutral, where there's absolutely no real integration of culture whatsoever, to generic. Culturally generic texts might have, for example, a character, it'll have a diverse named character, but it's not about culture itself. It's not about any specific cultural aspects. So a great example of that kind of book is The Snowy Day by Ezra Jack Keats. It's a wonderful book. It's a wonderful text. It's a Caldecott Award winner, actually the first major award winner that featured an African-American child as the main character, right? But that's kind of something that any child can relate to, right? Anybody can go out and play in the snow, and that's kind of that, that kind of theme that's running through that book. Whereas a culturally specific text is something that, well, anyone could still maybe relate to in some way, but it is sharing and really showcasing that culture such that you cannot separate it out. So if you were to interchange the main characters with characters from some different culture, it would fundamentally change the entire text, right? So those cultural aspects are really critical to the plot line and to the characters and the themes of the book, right? So anyway, that's something that absolutely is discussed in this class, and this is something that's running through students' heads. They may or may not be able to articulate that, or they may not, when they come to the desk, they may not articulate that, right? They may just say, I just need a diverse book, right? And some of them are really good about it though, right? Especially if they do share more specifics of the assignment. There's also this idea that is absolutely always major in our literacy classes, especially. I know they talk about this extensively again and again, that they're looking for books that could be a mirror or a window, or they might do both, right? So a book that is a mirror is going to reflect back. So you're seeing your own experience in that text. Something that is a window is going to show you somebody else, show you something that is not like your own experience. So that's also something that definitely comes into play. And a lot of the time, I know that a starting point for a lot of folks is to say, okay, I'm looking for a book that's diverse. I'm just going to type in diversity and go, right? Which, if you were to type in diversity or culture, something like that, those real broad general terms, it'll bring up some things, right? It'll bring up a few things, but it's still ineffective. It's still not going to give you like a rich overview of what's really in the collection, what's really there. So there's just something else to keep in mind, is the way in which you're searching this. And I know Jen will get into this, some of this much later on, actually. But all right, so that was kind of the background of where this started. I created the guide. It started small. It was a single page. So back in fall of 2016 is actually when it was first created. But it was really something that, as the more I kept using it, the more I would bring it up in the class or maybe use it for a reference interaction, I started to realize something. It was this one single page guide. it was starting to get really crammed and it really didn't do quite what I wanted it to do, right? There wasn't enough there in terms of the hints and tips. So everything was kind of, as you see, as you go through, if you look at each of those bullet points, right, you see that it was kind of all these identities and cultures were really like, thrown together. Everything was kind of really crammed in. There were picture books because that's really where this started. I didn't have any other formats really showcased at the time. I had links, award winners, other resources, again, very crammed in. I pretty much couldn't fit anything else. You'd be scrolling through this page too much, right? And then again, no further hints or tips. And that was really the key. That was really something that I wanted to expand upon to make this guide more usable and useful to whoever was accessing it. I started to realize I really wanted to expand that. So it was definitely outgrowing the container, right? So it was definitely, there was definitely a need there to replant, essentially. Okay, so before we get into talking about our process, I do want to know your overall situation with diverse resources, right? So do you have any projects? Do you have anything ongoing? So this is kind of like your current, right? What are you doing currently? So again, pollev.com/LCZIRR. If you still have it open, it should actually automatically refresh. And so hopefully it will in just a moment. Sometimes it takes a moment. You may need to refresh depending on your browser, but just kind of see, just curious where people are at, right? Some people might not be doing much at this time, right? Kind of starting out, modernizing, that's definitely a good one, right? To think about. Oh, cool. Scientist authors. Oh, that's neat. So BIPOC scientist authors. Current events. Yep. I think being responsive, I like that word responsive. I think that's kind of cool. Overhauling the collection development policy. We're working on our collection development policy too, actually, our general one. Ooh, annual National African American Poetry Read-In. Oh, that sounds cool. Ooh, ebook collection. Yes. I like ebook especially right now, right? With what we've been dealing with. Yep, LibGuide. Yeah, juvenile. Okay, great. I'm really happy to see other folks here who are working with juvenile collections, right? So good. So we've got some really good things. A Black Lives Matter guide, right? So absolutely. I think this is definitely something that is in mind, or people are starting to really think about ways they can address this in collections. Yep, fiction titles, underrepresented groups, right? Ooh, trauma-informed teaching. Great. I like the graphic novel one too. I'm definitely seeing a lot of good ideas. So folks are definitely, this is really exciting. I'm excited by all of this, right? I love seeing what different things people are working on. So good. So there's definitely a lot of good current projects going on out there. And I think even looking at your policies is a great way to look, right? So where's that big picture, right? In your library, where's that coming from? So excellent. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about the process. I'm going to talk about kind of the broad overview, the kind of the structure, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jen actually to talk more about. She's going to get into the specifics of how we did this. I do want to make a point that I will show and tell later. So there will be a show and tell of the guide. Don't despair, that will come up. So I want to make sure that you know that. I just thought, we would talk about first kind of how we built it. You can see kind of the, where it came from. So we'll start out with those overall goals. So I just kind of hinted at this, right? I was talking just about how it was kind of, it was growing out of its container. So I really needed to expand. So my main goal was expanding. I wanted separate pages for some different topics. Maybe a few of those, those kind of different marginalized identities, things that would come up again and again in classes, right? That just looked like it was going to be really important and helpful. So absolutely, I needed to have something that was going to have different tabs, right? Different pages, essentially, for those who are familiar with LibGuides. I wanted, though, to have a unified structure. I wanted to make sure that as you went through, it was something that you could follow really easily, right? So the navigation would be really clear. You'd know what you were getting no matter what page you click on. And each page would include this set of materials. So some search tips to really help springboard, right? So a lot of the time when we put tips out, it's just something that's going to maybe give some inspiration, get people started. Books on, I wanted to expand to different levels and formats beyond just picture books, having more links and having those links maybe better organized. of course, and then just visuals, more visuals that would go with what's going on the page. So they'd be relevant visuals, they'd be informative, right? In addition to being visually appealing. So that was something to consider. And here's how the project went. So it was a team of 3 of us. So myself and the other 2, so Maria and Jenifer were both on board with this. We did this during the pandemic summer. So we all know that experience. And if I just say the pandemic summer, you know exactly what I'm talking about. This was fully virtual. So it was actually started in early July of 2020, and we did complete it by late August. So before the semester started. Because we were fully virtual, we had to meet through virtual means. So our library, we were using Microsoft Teams, like in general, to organize things, right, for our different committees. So it just made sense, right? It was a natural thing just to jump into Teams. So we did meet asynchronously, emails, the asynchronous, right? The first asynchronous form of conversation. We would use an email for those more detailed conversations, like say you had a big bulleted list you wanted to share, it was kind of like, big meaty things. But Teams was excellent because we could just ask a question here and there, right? What about this image? What do you think about this image? You could share it with the group, or I was thinking of adding this book, or I was thinking of adding this section. So it's just a great way to kind of communicate those quick things. And what was also nice is we were able to go back and look at Teams, so I could go back and see, right, what we talked about. It was very helpful for, getting ready for this presentation, but just in general, to see how that project went. So something that's really, really kind of interesting or cool about having that is that you were able to go back and kind of see the structure and the way things flowed throughout the project. We did meet a few times through Teams, through video chat to discuss things. Sometimes you just need a verbal conversation, right, to talk about details. And then, so that's something that we did. That's kind of our organization. I researched other libraries for ideas. And because I was dealing with children's literature, and I was dealing with kind of like popular children's literature, right? It's something that was a little different and kind of outside of scope of a lot of academic libraries. Unless they happen to have a teaching materials collection, which many do, right? There are several if you have, especially in the education department. But I was finding most of the ideas for what I really envisioned from other libraries, like school libraries, right? But anyway, so I was able to put together kind of a template for what I wanted to see. So there were hidden tabs that I created, hidden pages. And then once the basic structure was in place, we could divide and conquer. And this is actually the point I'm going to turn it over to Jenifer to talk about how that worked.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lisa. So this is a little sneak peek. Lisa is going to take you on a tour through the guide in a little bit. So we have the main guide, which was the diversity in children's literature is what we call it. And then the tabs at the top, the one that's labeled anti-racism in the middle, so they start out with welcome and getting started, general diversity and culture, culturally specific, which goes along with the class, one of the classes Lisa was talking about. And then we had a tab called race and activism. And the same thing happened on that particular page of this guide that happened on the original page Lisa was talking about. It sort of got overgrown, and we decided to create a sub-guide that had more tabs involved in it, so we have a whole second sub-guide to cover all the different topics in anti-racism that we wanted to cover. And then we have immigrants and refugees, LGBTQ, poverty, disability, and women's rights. So you want to go to the next slide, Lisa? So to fill these out, Maria and I divided up the tabs and each took certain ones, and we're working on different pages. Lisa suggested, looking at other libraries. So we were doing a lot of looking. So yes, librarians went to Google and we started Googling, what other libraries were doing, where I reinvent the wheel if we could find something really interesting other people had a list for. We found a lot of lists of books and different resources, which were fantastic. Interestingly, because it's children's literature, you sometimes find resources that are created for parents or teachers. And we tried to aim more at the resources for teachers, although the ones for parents did have, links and resources that we liked as well. So it is important to see what's out there. on the topics that you're trying, because we're trying to divide this into many, many different topics that we were working on. Next slide, please. So then you get to the point where you have nice lists of different resources that you want to include, like different books. You know, that we have a list of links that we are listing, and we want to highlight certain books in each of these categories. We had easy readers, the young adult books, we had graphic novels section, and we have a nonfiction section on each page. So we would take books we found we liked, we'd search for them in the catalog. And if we found them, great, we could add a link to that book and put up the little cover image on the guide. It was a great project for just creating a wish list for when we do have a little bit of money later on. I mean, I don't think any of us have a lot of collection development money at this very moment with everything that went down with the pandemic, but we are able to have lists we can turn to in the future. The other thing that was interesting is because we were at home and we were not in the building, you couldn't just run down to the TMC and pull a book off the shelf and look at it and say, does this really fit my need? So we ended up having to read book reviews if we weren't familiar with the book. A lot of libraries have been posting like story times with books on YouTube. That's another place that you can find, you know, get into the book and see what it looks like as if somebody has read it to a group, and you can find the librarian going through the book. So this was really helpful. And as we were looking at the books, even if we had the book or we didn't, do you want to go to the next slide, please, Lisa? The subject headings were so key, because that will lead you to more and more and more. And the terms the students are searching, or the things we might think to search, aren't always, you know, what the catalog system uses for subject headings for these books. So, you know, Library of Congress subject headings. So getting in there and looking in our catalog when we found a book at the different subject headings that were listed, and then searching for more like that. Or if it was a subject we didn't own quite as much, going into WorldCat, looking at books and looking at subject headings. And keeping track of all of those was really important, because Lisa wanted this section of search tips for the students. So I gave an example here from the Anti-Racism Activists page, where it gives some examples of broad concepts and then specific concepts that you can look up in the catalog to find more. So that was really helpful when we were creating these tips and tricks. Is just, I guess my takeaway is keep a lot of notes on where, you know, what subject headings you like and what's working for you, because you can just build them right into the section. Okay, Lisa.
Jenifer, can we share the lib guide? I got a question privately. Is it the Diversity in Children's Literature lib
Yeah,
guide?
I can grab that link. Lisa is
Thank
just
you.
about to show it in like 2 slides.
Perfect.
I was going to say,
See?
yeah, yep,
Perfect
absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Feel free to share. Yep, we wanted to share it anyway. So no time like the present. So absolutely. Thank you so much. So yeah, I'm going to talk about, our challenges and our aha moments, right? Our snags. But actually, fortunately, we did not have too much in the way of these kind of setbacks. Jenifer did already talk a little bit about this, right? She already mentioned about how we did, we had a limited access to the print collection. So we had to use our workarounds, like the Children's Literature Comprehensive Database, which we subscribe to, is great for kind of putting together a bunch of book reviews, so you can see a lot about a book that way. But yeah, those online read alouds on YouTube, just looking online in general, maybe seeing a book preview, seeing some material there. But one of the things that you do lose when you don't have the print collection also is that serendipity of discovery, right? You can't just walk up to the shelf and then you see something else on the shelf, or see something like on a new books display. I know Jenifer had that experience just the other day, kind of the building and seeing, oh, there's a book that's great, right? So that's one thing that is kind of lost when you're not actually seeing stuff in person in print. But then also, we did have the budget constraints as well, like everybody else across the board, right? We've kind of paused. So if you happen to see a fun new title, right, there was no way to access it, at least currently, right? So it was something that we kind of put on our wish list. I absolutely was prioritizing materials. And actually, I think that snag leads into an aha moment, because fortunately, my pre-existing collection development plan already had in place diverse topics was and had been for a while a focus of mine, and still is. Because of the education department, their curricular needs, their interests have been aligned and very interested in diverse children's literature for a long time. So that was something that was already in place, which was great because then we had stuff to draw from. It was just a matter of being strategic to find it, like Jenifer has already alluded to, right? So there was that. So it was already in my plan. We also had been using the Junior Library Guild, which you can think of like an approval plan. It's really aimed at like school and public libraries because it is for juvenile books, right? Children's literature, young adult literature. They have a pretty good multicultural category, for instance, that you can subscribe to. So that was something that was also helpful. And when I do my collection development, one resource that has come up in the past, I'll just mention it, that I made extensive use of was a diverse book finder for looking at, and I have it, it's linked to within, I know it's linked to in the guide that we're sharing. So it's definitely out there, but that is a great resource to use, even just to look for backlog stuff that, just to help build the collection. So if you're kind of curious or interested in building the collection, it really breaks it down by topic, different identities, different cultures are represented. So there is that. We also, our campus was responding to, a lot of what was going on. So thinking about current events, what we were dealing with, right? What we're still dealing with. They created a committee that created a 21-day anti-racism challenge for the campus. So this was something that was aimed at anyone, any individuals could take it. Our library also had created an anti-racism task force that, looked into and eventually developed and took this 21-day challenge and adapted it to the library. So as a library staff, we actually took a 21-day challenge altogether. It was really, I will say, it was a very eye-opening process. It was extremely valuable overall to have these conversations among ourselves. And so it was great as an individual. But thinking not just as an individual, but also as a librarian. So what does allyship look like, to you, right, yourself? But what does it look like to you as a librarian? For the library, for the workplace, right? For the collections. So I was kind of looking, you start looking at these books and I start thinking about this through a new lens, right, essentially. So looking at these books about race and looking at different language and concepts and different ways to search for and potentially explore new avenues, right, new books to add, new ideas to add, things I hadn't thought of before, right, that the challenge really kind of helped with. And, and even just the language, like, that race and activism section, we have to call it anti-racism because that's the actual, right, the main term that, that should be used, the recognized term, right? So that's something to keep in mind. And that 21-day challenge came up in, we ended up doing it as a library in March of 2021. So just to give you a little bit of the timeline there. So it was after this guide, this expanded guide had been in use for, a semester, right? It had been used in the fall, and then this kind of happened, and it absolutely did help us develop. And I'll talk about that, something else that helped with later when I get into the future material. So I have another poll question before I actually do the show and tell. So how might this apply to your situation? I wanted to give you a couple, things to consider. So maybe are there specific classes or disciplines, research assignments, maybe other anti-racist projects or initiatives that are already happening on your campus that you know of? But what do you think? Is there some way you might do something like this or adapt this, right, to what you're doing? It might look a little different for you, right? Everything will kind of depend on the way your campus is set up, the projects you already have going on, right? But in this case, how might this apply? So not just what you're already doing, but what might you do? So again, poev.com/LCZIRR, or wait for it to update. Disability, yes. Yep, updating LibGuides. We are in the middle of a big LibGuides overhaul ourselves. So our research guides, right? But I think there's definitely a case to be made for taking these anti-racist ideas and concepts and, right, bringing them over to how we do LibGuides. Gen Ed courses. Interesting. They're focusing on diversity and inclusion. Okay, yeah, that is kind of difficult, right? Not everybody is equally engaged. We kept when we did that 21-day challenge, it's not like that was mandatory, right? It was open to anyone who was interested and able. So yep, that might be kind of a difficult one to grapple with. So how do you deal with that? That could be its own presentation, right? See if there's anything else, and then I'll Moving to the show and tell. Oh, great. Thank you. Appreciate it. Allyship is so important, and I think we're all trying to develop and grow, right? And that's absolutely the idea with taking things like the 21-day challenge, just being willing to learn, right? I think that's critical. Yeah. Okay, so let's see here. I'm gonna get out of this and I'm gonna open up and we're gonna do some show and tell, show and share, right? So this is the guide. It's already been thrown into the chat, I think, right? So portland.libguides.com, TMC diversity. So I do have a friendly link there. But this is it. So this is kind of where it is now. So we've got our starting page here with a little bit of material. We have an accessibility like statement and actually a whole guide. So we link to that. And then I do have text that will guide folks through. So users of this guide are told to click through the tabs on this page for the big general search tips. And by general, I do mean these are real general, like just making sure they're limiting down to our teaching materials collection, right? So they're not getting something that's a college level book for a first grader, that sort of thing, right? Start simple, start concrete. So look for specific holidays, foods, aspects of culture. A lot of the time, those cultural values and the deeper cultural aspects are going to be more embedded, especially if you're looking for a picture book. They might be more embedded inside of a book. I've hinted at this already, but be specific. So multicultural may or may not give you, right, exactly what you need. Be willing to think about, well, what's a culture you want to look into a little further, right? So you want to explore Japan, and you might want to look at Japanese culture. You might want to look at something, right, super specific. So that will help, something you're interested in. I'll talk about the combined topics later. That is something that comes up where people are trying to do more than one thing, right? So sometimes a Boolean search is what you need. Sometimes you need to get creative with that, and that's on there. That can be a little tricky. And then don't be afraid to use and explore those outside resources like the Children's Literature Database. They actually publish themed book lists that can be helpful, or just find a themed book list online and kind of start exploring that way. So there's all kinds of resources out there to help. And then I'll go through a few of these tabs just so you get like a sense of how the guide is structured. But general diversity and culture. So there's our image, right? This one's really kind of a really fascinating image you could take time with and look more closely at. But absolutely, please do, right? If you have the link to explore. The search tips are right on top. And this is the real general one. So this is the set of picture books that are just like the compare contrast. I do have award-winning book lists on here. All the award-winning book lists are also in the respective categories where they fit too. So you might see those more than one place. Multiple cultures in one book. So there's the whole families around the world, school days around the world, that kind of comparison. Next tab over, I get into, culturally specific texts, but you see how it does follow that similar, right? Same outline. So when you're navigating through, you know what you're seeing. You're seeing the search tips and hints. You're seeing some specific picture books for ideas. You're seeing the links that go with this. There's a lot of great resources out there to help, especially to get at those culturally specific texts, right? The ones, and I do have a definition here. The definition is meant to help jog students' memories, but then also librarians who might be using this also, right, to help them help the students. The anti-racism section, which Jenifer mentioned, is actually its own, right? It's its own tab. So you see that here. You see that we've got everything from, tools for teachers, because again, this is aimed at education students, right? Pre-service teachers. So there's tools for teaching in addition to tools you would use with children, right? So you have maybe a picture book you'd give to a child, but then we also have, ideas and hints and tips for, you, right, as a teacher, how do you explore and engage in these topics? So that's here, right? Different movements, holidays, like I know there's some excellent picture books on Juneteenth, for example. So absolutely, that's on here. Different materials here. Activists, other famous figures. I'll get into the joyful affirmations at the end. I'll talk in more detail about that. But that's that expanded area. And then I have some other, other marginalized groups that come up that absolutely each of these, just to throw one on, because somebody mentioned disability earlier. Again, hints and tips and ideas for how to search, right? So you get the idea, the structure, how this is laid out. All right, so hopefully that gives you a good overview of what this guide entails, right? And we'll talk about it later, but there's always room for expansion. You know, there's things I'm already thinking of. I'm going, oh, we could do this, right? But anyway, that is the guide in its current form. I wanted to include, let me just click through here, a little summary. So this is just what I just talked about, what I just showed you. I just want to make sure you have this to come back to if you're looking at this presentation later or watching this, right? Just so you can see it all in writings, right? So this is an expansion of what I talked about earlier when I said, here's what I wanted to see. Well, it did actually turn out to be pretty much what I had envisioned for this guide. So different categories, the tips, the books, the links, and the images. So that just kind of, broadens out what I talked about already. But the important thing is having that room to grow. Having those different spaces, right, where you can kind of expand and have all kinds of different ideas for folks to look at, right? So all those example books, all those different links and resources, and people who might be looking for something really specific now have places to go. All right, so use in classes. So absolutely, of course, EDU 340, the original class it came from, they use it. Now, when they were going into placements, I know a lot of them were being asked to find books that were culturally responsive, culturally specific, and also did some other topic. So they might be looking for gender roles and friendship, or some culture, any culture, something cultural that has some aspects of culture, and math or science, etc. Some of those can get tricky, right? There's absolutely ways to get into those, and you can find some excellent, say, especially for the culture and science is a good one because there's some great biographies that are out there. So there's definitely different ways you can explore and search that, but that's what that one search tip is all about is, okay, say you are looking for some combined topic, right? How can you do that? Because sometimes you want to do Boolean, sometimes you want to just kind of maybe do a little browsing through one of those and see what's there. There's some different approaches for that. So anyway, that's one that definitely comes up. Lit 371 is an example that is just this past semester, actually, or yeah, it was this past semester, this past fall, the professor approached me before the class and said, I really need them to find anti-racist books this time for the read aloud project they were doing. So, again, it's thinking about this, this awareness being raised, I think, across campus. But anyway, they were looking for that. Foundations in Social Advocacy is our special education track, and they're specifically looking at books with disabilities represented. And I know that one of them is definitely looking at picture books. And again, that big broad term, especially when you're looking at picture books, doesn't quite cut it. You may need to, and I know that the search tips I give are, look for specific disabilities, get more specific, right? And I think, in general, there are all kinds of other assignments, read alouds, placements, right? So that's really individual, it depends on the placement, what the student is doing. There's all kinds of other applications. And I think that, especially thinking about reference and research help, right? You as the professional also want to be able to step in and you want to be able to suggest something to students, right? Being able to help them get beyond, say, Cat in the Hat, or, some of those usual kind of classics that, everybody kind of knows. How do you help kind of open those students' minds to something else, right? So having a guide like this in place can absolutely help you to do something like that. All right, so now I'm going to turn it over to Jen, who's going to talk about kind of our data, our usage stats, some really interesting stuff there. So go ahead.
So as you probably maybe figured out, we use the Spring Share LibGuides module to do these guides online. And we get a lot of interesting statistics from that platform when we go to look and see how many people have landed on the page, or the different tabs in the page, as well as where they came from to get there. So we're going to talk about that in relation to the main diversity and children's literature guide and that sub anti-racism guide, as well as look at some of our research help transcript data. Next slide, please. So what I did was we finished the guide up towards the end of the summer, and it was available for the fall semester, but we were still kind of getting the word out, letting professors know that it had really been enhanced and expanded. So the information that I pulled to post here is from the spring semester. So it started in February and ended in the middle of May. And it's kind of interesting to look at that line across the top, you can see when it was maybe shown in a class or there was a project due towards the end of the semester. This is the data for the main diversity in children's literature guide. So as you look down here, we're going to talk about the, let's see, some of the things like this anti-racism guide is its own page, like its own guide. So that's why it has 0, because it's got its own data. But people were, as you know, generally they go to the first page, they have a look around, they might go to the second page. This is pretty traditional, what you see in the research, but we do have people jumping off onto other pages as well. If you go to the next slide, Lisa. So this was specifically about that anti-racism guide, which is also getting quite a few views during the semester. And you can see the projects at the end spiking the views when the students are finishing up their end of semester projects. The joyful affirmations tab, which we added towards the end of the semester, hasn't really been advertised as much yet. Lisa's going to talk a little bit about that. It's a new addition. We had been to a conference and heard some things that made us really want to add another aspect to the guide. So I think the data is great. I think it also shows that we have some more publicity to do. Can you to the next slide, please? So here's some longitudinal data. And if you look, I've broken it into 2 columns. One is the student or the user directly navigated to the guide. The other one, they are coming from a link on the Teaching Materials Center main guide to the diversity guide. So if you look at, Lisa created that first page in 2016, that academic year. The usage is a little low. It's been growing every single year. You know, all kinds of usage in every aspect in our library kind of fell off a little bit during that real first beginning of the pandemic year. But then once we made the guide over that summer of 2020, look at how many people are using it, you know, over the fall and spring semesters and navigating to it. So the numbers really grew. It's important, I think, to look at this as something that actually is getting a lot of use. So it was definitely worth creating. It's a point of need. And you can kind of see how the jumping off to the guide from the main TMC guide is dropping down a little, because I think the professors are actually pushing the link out to the students, which is nice. And the next slide, please. So the thing that we looked at with the research help data, and since we have SpringShare, we also use the lib answers for our research help chat and keeping statistics for walk-up, people who walk up or email in or call on the phone. So I was going back through and looking, what do students actually ask when they're doing their research? Lisa mentioned that before. I need a multicultural book. Well, that's pretty broad. Like, what exactly are you asking for? So I think this tips and tricks section of how to search kind of really gets them thinking about, well, what is my question actually? Like, what do I actually need? So the one column is what, you know, reading through transcripts and also the couple sentences librarians type in when they help a walk-up question. Multiculturalism includes inclusive differences, traditions, specific things like Black History Month, race, racism. These are terms that seem to be coming from the students themselves. But then you get the second category where the students are literally just typing in phrases off their assignments. They have pulled out their syllabus and their assignment, and they're just looking at the professor's language. That I can tell you, in our library catalog, these words are not necessarily what you're going to find when you search the catalog. So we have to kind of, working with the TMC, we have to kind of help the other librarians understand what the assignment is really about and what the students are actually looking for. So the things like diversity, ethnicity, inclusion might be what you would expect, but culturally diverse, culturally specific, culturally responsive. And then of course, disabilities, there are so many different categories, and usually students just come in, I need a book about disability. Well, it really helps if you can say to them, be specific. Do you want ADHD, autism, mobility, sensory issues, deafness, blindness? Then we can get into what you're, an actual specific book that you're looking for. And one more. I think we're on to you, Lisa.
Yes, we are. Yep. Yep. Thank you, Jenifer. All right. And this last part will be pretty brief. I'm talking about our kind of like, future directions and explorations, right? Where we can take this from here, right? Absolutely. So these are things, to consider, for you to consider, for us to consider as well, right? So one thing to consider, of course, is that no guide is finished forever, right? It's never completely done. So whether you're going to do some kind of massive overhaul, like a project like we did, or, all along, I think a lot of us will do this. Something comes up, a new book is published that's really great and you want to add it, or, you come across a new website or someone lets you know about something, right? You attend a conference and learn about something. So there's all kinds of different, I think, opportunities to expand, right, in various ways, whether it's something big or small. One example of that is actually that joyful affirmations section that I mentioned, that we've alluded to. That was kind of our name, the way that we ended up finally naming it. What that came about from a conference, like Jenifer had mentioned. We all actually had attended it. And the presenter there was discussing how difficult it can be to find books that are actually coming at, all kinds of different identities, people of color, with just an uplifting sort of attitude, right? So they're talking about uplifting themes and topics. Of course, now I want to preface this by saying it is deeply important, of course, that everyone and that children especially learn about the struggle and the adversity, right? That is essential. They have to learn the truth of things that have happened, right, throughout the past. But think back to that talk that, that mention I said earlier about mirrors, right? And if we're always giving a child, books that are adversity and struggle, right? If every single book is about slavery, what is that mirroring back, right? Is that the only thing they should be seeing? So the presenter was talking about how difficult it can be sometimes to find these books that kind of, are in this uplifting category. And so when they were talking about that got me thinking, if it's so difficult to find, maybe we do need to help folks find that. One of the first ideas that sprang to mind when they were talking about that, I thought, well, I know we have a lot of picture books that talk about Black hair. There's some excellent children's books that do that. So there's a really great example of something that is kind of that, that uplifting category. Or even, if you think about the book Snowy Day, that's a book that is talking about, that is kind of having this just kind of joyful experience, right? So we added that category in several different places where it made sense. So that is also in there. That was something that was a pretty late edition. It actually happened late in the spring, but I'm sure there's definitely room to expand additional categories, different award winners. I actually kind of have some guides to specific ones that we collect, the big ones, but there's some that I've been collecting from more unofficially that I could expand. Potentially, we have this kind of it's a culturally specific, but maybe we do want to have that expand out to different, some very specific cultures. We have to kind of decide though what that's actually ultimately how that would look, right? How do you expand it so it doesn't get too expansive? So there's definitely ideas to play around with. But one takeaway and one thing to consider is definitely working with what you have. Do a deep dive, right? Do a little bit of it, poking around in your own collection. Like Jenifer was mentioning, trying out maybe some different search terms, different ideas, different ways of approaching and rephrasing, right, how you're searching. So that's something to consider, absolutely. And then, alongside that, I think other projects that might be happening are definitely something to harness, right? That's why when I asked that one question earlier, like, are there things happening on your campus that you might think about, right, incorporating or being part of? A really great example, the 21-day challenge, which I mentioned earlier, our campus-wide one, actually became this almost like a loop of sorts, because we definitely used it and learned from it to inform ourselves, but they also did, we have one of our librarians is actually on that committee. And so we were able to get that link, the link to this guide was also pushed out there. So that's another place where we were able to share what we have, right? And so that was really helpful to to us, in a couple of different ways. I'm also part of a committee called Sophia's Garden, which is the philosophy department. They have an initiative where they go into schools and they're really talking about, they're using books that talk about philosophical concepts with a social justice kind of lens. So that was one, that's one that I'm involved in. So maybe there's committees, in other words, that you might be part of, or you could get involved in and work that way. So faculty partnerships are always a possibility, right? It may start with something that you're teaching. It may start in a class. It may be something that you can grow. It's something that you might start small and then expand, right, over time. And then, of course, library-wide adaptations. We've talked about potentially, is there a way to maybe get something that is cross-disciplinary, for example? There's another thought, right, of something that could be a future potential direction to take. Okay, so we do have this one final question. So, you've already considered kind of like what you're already doing, kind of thinking about, brainstorming maybe where you could go, but what is something like, definite that you can do, your seed to plant, right, this summer? How can you continue growing, maybe something new or something that you've already started, right? Maybe you've already planted that seed, just needs a little water, it just needs a little something, right, to start. So go right ahead and tell us what's one thing that you definitely think you can do soon. Love to hear from you. Yep, so policy, yep, the collection development policy. And that's something that I think anybody, right, any library, that's one that I think most people could connect with and could start doing, right? So even if you're not currently doing that, well, hey, that's a good starting point. Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee, right? Applicable LibGuides. I think that's an excellent thing, because absolutely, and I think, and hopefully that's part of definitely what we wanted to convey with this presentation is making connections, right? Connections is important, making people aware, right? Raising awareness, suggested books, good, stronger LibGuides, yep. So getting more strong, strong with your diversity, equity, and inclusion, kind of themed things, right? And I think, you can definitely prioritize it, right? When you are thinking about collection development, you're thinking about, you might be working with a limited budget, not only working with what you have, but, thinking ahead, right, to building your collection. Programming, yes, what kind of library events and outreach could you do surrounding, right, these topics and themes? Ooh, kind of a life issues self-help collection. Oh, that's really fascinating. I love this idea because, if you're thinking about it, I'm thinking of that, mirror concept, right? Having self-help books that are going to have those different voices, right? Because if you think about it, that's one thing to consider. Not just what's missing from your collection, but who's missing from your collection, right? So if you're, are you including those diverse, voices, right? When people are looking for self-help, they're looking for something that might, right, speak from experience, right? That they're aware of, right? That will help. Yep. I like that. Good. Good. And this may be something that also beyond this session, right, you may take this away and just think about it. But start, the big thing to consider is start simple. Start with something that you can do, right? Make that one little change. Say if it is something to do with a LibGuide, if it is just exploring and starting with what you have, that's just a great way to get going with a project like this. At this time, if we have any questions,
we do. We actually have quite a number of them in the chat. So, Tim from Jamestown Community College, do you want to unmute yourself, or want me to go ahead and
I can do that. Yeah, I was just wondering if this LibGuide you put together and all these ways you push this out. Have you had the ability to look at these collections and how much usage, and if that's there's been a direct link there? So that's the question. Thanks. Great conversation.
Great, wonderful. So you're talking about the usage of the actual collections.
Yeah, the physical, because I looked quickly through and it seemed like they're all physical books, right? They're not ebooks, or I don't know. Are picture books and ebooks? I don't even know.
That is, what an excellent question. That is topic that, it can be a little bit of a tricky one, actually. So yeah, finding ebooks of picture books is actually difficult, highly difficult. There's a couple reasons for that. I think one of them is that if you think about it, the way that these are used, for the most part, they're going to be print books, the way that they're used in the classrooms and with children, with students. So I think that one thing is the way they're used. But then also, we have a policy, for example, in place. We collect ebooks. We absolutely do have ebook. We've got a couple resources for ebooks. So we, buy individual titles. We have, ebook databases, but they have to be multi-user. They have to be a certain type of ebook, right? So it can't be something where like a single user checks it out. And sometimes you can't find the right kind of book, or they're just not available through the resources we use to collect books. So availability of ebook versions of picture books is very difficult. Absolutely. So that's something that is you could add that to the challenges, right? And especially thinking about the past year and being away from the print collections, right, during COVID. There were the workarounds, like finding some things online, finding some read alouds, a lot of the more popular titles out there. So yeah, you can assess obviously the LibGuide through, like we talked about, the data. You could look at circulation data for print, of course. That's another idea, another angle to consider. If you want to kind of do an assessment of maybe particular titles, there could be a way to do that. Yep, absolutely. That's something to maybe another future project to consider, right? How are these things actually circulating? And has the circulation changed, right, since the incorporation of the guide? So these are definitely good questions to address. But
we also have a question from Marianne Herbert. Yeah. Marianne, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Yeah, so I'm curious about, books. Kitty lit is not an area that I have any strength in, but when I found out that Skippy John Jones was considered to be offensive to Spanish-speaking people, I was like, oh yeah, I can see that. So I'm curious about how to get students to use a lens to assess some of the books, especially if you're sending them off to do a search and they find, stuff that seems, it's got the call to cut little, or that was I think had an award for Speak Aloud or something like that. But yeah, so do you address that at all? Or is that something that the professor would address? Or, I mean, we would not necessarily read that from our collection. We would leave stuff like that in our collection.
Right, correct. And I agree with you on that because, if you think about it, we are serving a different population than, say, a school library or a public library would be very different, right? You might be reading certain things, for different reasons, right? And we do want to keep things in so people can recognize and say, oh gosh, wow, this has really offensive stereotypes, like you're saying, right? So they can examine books and be critical about them, because I think it's important that students are critical about them. And I know that in the LibGuide, I do link to, especially in the culturally specific, there's a couple of great resources. There's a good social justice books resource that actually kind of walks through some criteria to look at. So I know I actually teach this in that 340 class. It's kind of like, and I know a lot of us are familiar with evaluation of sources in general, or evaluation of, say, you might have, say you use the CRAP method or something, right, for evaluating research. There are definitely strategies in place for evaluating children's literature in that way. You may not have the time, of course, to sit down with students and do that, right? A lot of the time that is done within the scope of the class. But I think that absolutely, and I did allude to this in the presentation, as professionals, I think we should steer students, right? And I think we should be having these conversations with them on some level. It really does depend though. Some reference interactions, you have time, you have the room to talk about it or to share with them links. Because like I said, I have a link that actually has a nice chart on it and say, hey, consider this, right? And sometimes you don't have as much time, so you have to kind of quickly help them and say, well, have you considered this? Have you considered, giving them some recommendations? And Jen, I don't know if you have anything else to add. I want to make sure, if you have any other ideas that you use.
I think you covered it well. Thank you. I did want to mention, though, that I did put the link to the page about the SUNY Cortland 21-day challenge in the chat. There was a question about if we could share more information about that.
Terrific. We have about 2 minutes left if anybody has additional questions for our presenters. In the meantime, I'll just announce that we had a little trouble getting the captioning up and running for this. So I'm assuming that SUNYLA will go ahead and caption this before sharing it with anyone. So I hope that that wasn't an issue for you, but if it was, rest assured that that will happen.
One last thing, Carol Ann, thank you very much for sharing your guide also in the chat from SUNY Albany. That's great.
And I'm also putting a link in the chat to one of those resources that I like to use. That's a really good resource. So something you can, something you could potentially consider doing is even just pull that up and just show it real briefly to students, right? Again, it depends on your how much time you have with your reference interaction. I know sometimes students are in a hurry, right?
Yeah, some of those links have picture books. They're older and in the public domain.
Wonderful. We have about a minute left. Anybody else have any questions for our presenters? It was a lot of information. Well, I can't thank you both enough. It seems like there's a lot for us to think about and to challenge us as we all open up and take on all sorts of new responsibilities. I think, all understand, all the people who came to this session today understand that this is one of those responsibilities that we've always had, but we need a new focus on. So we thank you for bringing this and your ideas to the front for us.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for it.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Lots of praise in the chat for you all. Lots of thanks and praise.
Wonderful. Well, we hope people get something out of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Takeaways. that's what, even if somebody gets one little takeaway,
yeah, absolutely.
It's always the hope from these presentations.
Yeah. And now I'm looking back at all of my lab guides, not only for that sort of critical race and diversity piece. I hate to use just race because I really mean all diversity, but the last session I was at was from one of my cohort colleagues in accessibility who was looking specifically at live guides and how those can be more accessible. So now I'm going back and having to look at all my live guides and seeing all of the things that I need to fix and tweak, and all of those images that I didn't quite have all text on that I should have, things I maybe have copied over and assumed all text. So yeah, so we have the whole diversity piece, we have the whole accessibility piece. There's a lot of work to do.
Yes, definitely. Overhauling the guides is like,
yeah,
that's a big summer project. Yeah.
Constant struggle. Yeah. All right, thank you both so much.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.